followed by the pound sign.
After the tone, please state your name.
Welcome to today's webinar, Pink Brain, Blue Brain, Females and Males in Math and Science, presented by Lise Elliott. My name is Greg Nagy, and I am the Virtual Learning Community Manager from The Ohio State University, who provides technical support for the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. Before we start the presentation, I would like to go over some housekeeping items for this webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last roughly 1 hour and is being recorded in order to view this presentation in its entirety later. The recorded webinar will be available in the next few days on the www.stemequitypipeline.org website. As you've already found out, you will be watching the presenter present slides through the live meeting interface while listening to them talk over your phone. If you cannot get the live meeting software to work today, you can download today's slides from the home page of the stemequitypipeline.org website and follow along using your phone. All the attendees' phones have been automatically muted. The presenter will answer questions after the presentation. However, we can take questions at any time. This is how we take questions. At any time during the presentation and during the Q&A, you may submit a question by clicking on the button labeled Q&A at the top left of your live meeting window, type in your question, and then click the Ask button. The presenter or I will read and respond to these questions at the end of the presentation. You can download today's slides from the handout icon at the top right of your live meeting window. Also, we are not using web video and a webcam today, just using the phone for audio and the slides through the live meeting. I would like to start the webinar by introducing Mimi Lufkin, CEO, National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity and STEM Equity Pipeline Project Director. Mimi?
Thank you very much, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody this afternoon, and I'm particularly excited about this webinar with Lise Elliott, and I'm looking forward to her presentation. I just wanted to welcome you all to another webinar being conducted by the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. This is a grant that we received from the National Science Foundation, and the recipient of that grant is the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity Education Foundation. Our project is specifically focused on working with individuals who conduct professional development in states and providing high-quality professional development nationally through avenues such as this webinar. We hope you enjoy today's presentation, that you learn a lot from it. Please take the opportunity to ask questions as we go along by using the Q&A function that Greg just mentioned to you. I will also help manage the question and answer process, so please feel free to use that. And I don't want to take up any more of Lisa's time because I know we've got a lot to hear from her. So let me quickly introduce Lise Elliott to you. Lise is the Associate Professor of Neuroscience at the Chicago Medical School of Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science. Chicago native, she received an AB degree from Harvard University, a PhD from Columbia University, and did postdoctoral research at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. In addition to teaching and writing, Dr. Elliott lectures widely on children's brain and mental development. You may be most familiar with her as the author of Pink Brain, Blue Brain, How Small Differences Grow into Troublesome Gaps and What We Can Do About It. Dr. Elliott lives in Lake Bluff, Illinois with her husband, a 15-year-old daughter, a 13 and a 10-year-old son, and has been studying this topic for many, many years. And I am really looking forward, Lise, to hearing to what you have to tell us. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great.
All yours.
Thank you very much, Mimi. Thanks, Greg, for coordinating all this, and thanks to Freda for being a liaison. I'm really happy to be here and look forward to your questions. I do have a lot of material to get through, so I'm going to talk as quickly as I can and hopefully have time for questions. The reason I have a lot to talk about is this is based on the research I did for a book, which instead of a 2-year project sort of morphed into maybe 6 years. And part of the reason it took me so long was because my thesis literally flipped midway through writing the book. As Mimi said, I was already very familiar with brain development in children, and along the way I'd come across references to gender differences. As a parent of both a daughter and sons, I was naturally very curious, and really I think I got caught up in the whole zeitgeist of of male-female differences has been influenced a lot by popular presentations of evolutionary psychology, as well as some of the more troubling pop science that I'll talk about in a moment. But literally, I did sort of flip while writing this book, and instead of explaining all the ways in which boys and girls are hardwired for different abilities, came to realize that while there are clearly innate differences, they are dramatically magnified by the ways in which we raise our children and the experiences and basically the broader culture. So that's the perspective that I will be presenting today, and it's a bit of a complicated message, so I've tried to put it together as a little synopsis on this next slide. In short, there are real differences between boys and girls and their abilities, and presumably in their brains, although I think the science is still very early in telling us what they are. However, if we really look at the data, those differences are smaller than I think most people currently believe, and particularly teachers who are buying into this notion that boys and girls learn differently when there's really very, very little evidence for that. And so I want to kind of dissect some of the hype that teachers are hearing about boy-girl differences or male-female differences in the brain and show you how poorly proven this is, and as well as open your eyes to the idea that any difference we see in adult men and women's brains is really not very helpful for understanding innate abilities, because as myself and everybody else who's studied neuroplasticity understands, the brain is intimately shaped, both structure and function, by experience, and I'll show you some examples for that. I think we also can use the example of a girl's really remarkable improvement over the last few decades, particularly in math and science. I mean, I agree we have further to go, but there's no question girls have made remarkable advances, as well as in athletics, that really proves this malleability or neuroplasticity. In my other work, I talk about how we don't give boys the benefit of the doubt of that neuroplasticity. We have them now written off as unable to read and write and so on, but I think the same plasticity applies both ways. And yet, there is more we can do for girls. I think we all agree that the pipeline is too leaky, and keeping more females on track in STEM careers is going to depend on earlier immersion, particularly in a rather forgotten area of spatial skills, as well as all the cultural enrichment that I think people have appreciated for some time that girls need to see themselves as scientists and to see science and engineering as actually female careers, because I think the stereotypes are still, as we all know, getting in our way. So let me then jump into some of the background for this. So this is where we are as a culture. We're kind of imbued with this Mars-Venus idea that men and women are fundamentally different, that we're hardwired for different things. That, of course, has been the predominant view throughout most of time. It was only maybe in the 60s, 70s, early 80s when we sort of suspended our disbelief and thought maybe these differences are culturally influenced, and now I think we're back into this hardwired mode. But that's really been picked up a lot in the popular press, and so Time Magazine keeps coming out every now and then with headlines, and Newsweek, and you're probably familiar with the alternating boy crisis and girl crisis. We had the girl crisis, the Ophelia phenomenon, maybe in the late 80s and 90s, where we were worried about girls, and then now that's flipped to boys. But in the context of today's seminar, we're really going to focus on this idea that women may or may not be hardwired for math and science. And of course, it popped back into the news in 2005, I believe, when Larry Summers made the really faux pas to claim that women are not intrinsically capable of performing at the highest levels of math and science. One thing that led Larry Summers astray was this data that has been also widely popularized, particularly this number up here. This is based on a long-standing study by Camilla Benbow and her colleagues at Vanderbilt University. And what they've done is administered the math SAT exam to 8th grade children. So this is obviously a very challenging exam to kids at that age. And their goal was to identify talented youth. And what they found was with the math portion of the test, initially, a much higher proportion of boys than girls that scored at this highest level. Obviously, scoring above 700 on the SAT exam when you're 13 or 14 years old is quite a feat. And so there was this dramatic ratio of boys to girls, and that was very widely publicized. Again, it was in Time magazine, Newsweek, and actually Larry Sommer cited that number as one reason why they have such a hard time finding female faculty at the highest caliber institutions in math and science. But what Sommer didn't know at the time, I'm sure he knows now, is that this number has steadily declined just in the last quarter century, and I think this is rather dramatic. We're now down to about a 3-to-1 ratio, even less, of boys to girls, and I don't think there's any basis for believing that won't continue to decline, that as girls increase their self-confidence in math and obviously are taking more math and taking math more seriously, more and more will be performing at this highest level. So that is part of the cultural background. Now, the other thing that is feeding in, in sort of a tangential way to this focus of women in science and math, is this stark enrollment gap in U.S. colleges. This is the basis, really, of the boy crisis we keep hearing about now. The fact that on college campuses in the U.S., the population has morphed from a predominant male population to females outnumbering males by about 57 to 43% now, which is getting to be quite noticeable on certain campuses. And, of course, that's not what we're seeing still in science and engineering, but it has, I think, cut into a bit the case that women are making for continuing the need to encourage girls in these underrepresented fields. I just wanted to arm you with a little bit further information. When we plot it by percentages, it does look rather stark, although I think the good news is things are finally leveling out. Of course, it's interesting, it crossed over right after the Vietnam draft was rescinded and men no longer needed their college deferments. But if we actually, instead of looking at percentages, if we look at raw numbers of individuals attending college, the news is actually better. Everybody's going to college in greater numbers, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. The gain looks more dramatic for girls than boys, but as I showed you, the percentage-wise, we seem to have leveled off at about a 53-47. And appreciate that that difference seems pretty stark, but part of the reason males aren't going to college in as high numbers as females is, one, there are many more males than females in the military, which is comprising a lot of students or individuals at this age range. And secondly, as I think many of you are aware, men traditionally have been able to gain good employment without college degrees, whereas a woman who's going to make the $25, $30 an hour that a plumber or carpenter is going to make traditionally has gone into clerical jobs, which actually require at least a junior associate's degree. So women have needed college degrees to earn the same salaries or close to the same salaries as men. So with that as background, let's focus then on the issue at hand. What's going on with women and girls going into science, technology, engineering careers? And I put a question mark here on the title because, I do think it's very important to continue to encourage girls. We still have a long way to go, but I don't want to lose sight of the progress that we have made. And so these data published by the U.S. Department of Education, I think should give us a lot of encouragement. In every one of these fields, the number of women receiving doctorates has obviously exploded in the last 4 decades. The gains, what I've plotted here is in order, or in the legend, is by proportion in 1970, so that the fields that had the lowest proportion are down here, and the fields that had the highest proportion in 1970 are at the top of the list. But what you see is gains in all of these fields. Now, Some areas have been more dramatic than others. For example, dentistry, I think, is rather remarkable that we're up to about 40% women dentists when we were down in a few percent in 1970. And so the news is generally good. Even engineering, if you just did it on a percentage-wise increase, has been quite dramatic over the last 40 years. I do not believe that this is the maximum we're going to achieve. I believe there are many more women qualified and who would be fulfilled by such careers when we begin to break down more cultural barriers. But the news is good. We have further to go. I think the biggest concern to me in this graph is the computer science field, which actually has done a bit of a dip down from the 80s. And there's no, this I think reflects when computers first came around, they didn't have a gender, but they've become more genderized as boys become more absorbed in video games than girls do. I think by the time kids exit high school, anything in the technology field or computer technology is associated in kids' minds more with a male career than female. So that's where we have a lot of PR work to do. So we could dissect this forever, but I better keep moving on. And to point out, just laying all the data out up front, that there's a reason why women are improving in all these fields, and there's a reason why they should continue to improve, because the actual difference in math performance in school children is quite small. It's statistically insignificant in early elementary school. Even at the very end of high school, it's quite small. As we'll see, just a 3-point gap on the last several years in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is the nation's report card that the U.S. Department of Education assesses a demographically correct group. And as you'll see shortly, this contrasts actually dramatically with the gap in reading score. So the average girl is doing really just fine in math and science, and there's no reason we don't have a large enough pool to fill those careers. Now those numbers look sort of surprising when we compare them with the SAT difference, which gets quite a lot of attention and is perhaps fueling some of this PR problem for girls. And while there's very little difference in average math performance in school-age children, among those who sit for the SAT exam, there has been this historical and very significant gap in the math portion. Boys scoring somewhere between 35 and 40 points higher throughout the history of this test. And but what's generally not appreciated among the population, and particularly among girls, when they get these test scores, and if they happen to hear this result, is the fact that the girls who take the SAT come from a demographically quite different group than the boys who take the SAT. Basically, they're from they're from more impoverished families. There's a much broader number of girls who take the SAT. And so we're not really comparing apples to apples. We're comparing apples to oranges. The boys are more skimmed off the top to take the SAT because, as I mentioned, they choose other careers that don't require college admissions tests. So I think the SAT exam, the popularization of it and the gender gap becomes a problem for girls' identification, and particularly if it's used for any type of scholarship criterion, would not be a particularly fair way to pick boys and girls. And then here's just some more data on an international scale. The PISA program for international student assessment that's conducted by the Organization for Economic Cooperation, involving several dozen nations around the world, developed nations. And here we see a gender gap in math performance among 15-year-old students. In pretty much every nation, boys are outperforming girls. However, there are a couple of countries in this group, I know it's a little blurry for you, but Iceland and Thailand, in which girls are actually outperforming boys on this test. And so what this tells us is that, yes, boys are doing better around the world in math, but girls are capable of it. And so there's something presumably environmental that is helping girls in certain cultures and helping boys in most other cultures. And these are the issues that we need to pay attention to. And I've just drawn a line here to show where the U.S. fits, which is on the more modest side in terms of gender gaps compared to other nations. And these are sort of a mix of Asian and European countries on the left. And then finally, I wanted to contrast that with the the same PISA exam of 15-year-olds looking at reading. And in this case, the bars are all going down because females outperform males in every country on this exam. And in that, it truly is every country. There are no exceptions at the moment, with the arrow showing where the U.S. boys and girls rank. But again, I want to point out that there's been a lot of analysis of this data, and perhaps it's not surprising, but the biggest factor that determines your test score on the PISA reading exam is actually how much reading you do for pleasure outside school. And in every one of these countries, girls read more than boys. They read more books, they read more text, and that obviously is contributing to their reading scores. So by the time they're 15, you can't blame it all on hardwired differences. There are certainly experiential and cultural factors that are important. So that brings me to the brain and how the brain learns and how I stepped into this gender difference after writing my first book on brain development in children. I'm not just plugging books here, but I like this picture because it's of my son who happens to be a very good reader and actually has had some struggles this year with math, so pretty much against all stereotypes. But I think allows me to introduce the idea of how the brain actually changes as a result of experience and how that idea has been left out of the equation of discussions of sex differences in math and science performance. So to make a very long story short, this is our best evidence for how the brain changes as a result of early experience. It comes from studies of the visual system I talk about extensively in my first book. And so the visual cortex is located back here. It obviously gets input from the eyes. And what we know from many, many studies of animals and children that were launched in the 1950s by David Hubel and Torsten Liesel at Harvard Medical School is that early experience is crucial for properly wiring up. Even something as simple as the ability to see depends on your normal visual experience early in life. And so children who are born with crossed eyes or strabismus, and because of the double vision this produces, they tend to squint one eye. That very disconcerting squint produces a miswiring, a permanent miswiring of their visual cortex. And this is just an example shown from the monkey brain. Animals who are reared with one eye closed shut from birth, you see that the zebra stripe pattern, the normal black-white stripes, which represent input from each of the two eyes, evenly dividing up the visual cortex. This doesn't happen in an animal deprived early in life of vision. The eye that was closed sends inputs to these black areas. So obviously the closed eye has very little cortical input, with the result that that eye remains functionally blind. It's a blindness that can't be corrected with a pair of glasses. It's a cortical blindness, and it's actually permanent. If you have a similar visual deprivation in a 70 or 80-year-old person with a cataract, there's no rewiring of their visual cortex. Their vision will return to normal once the cataract is removed. This is an early critical period, and I think is quite important as well when we consider gender behavior and development. So this just shows what we know about the critical period for different mental abilities. And in the case of vision, the critical period happens quite early and corresponds with the period in life when children actually produce an excess number of synapses in that visual cortex at the back of the brain. The brain is programmed to overproduce synapses so that a child's experience will select those connections that are most useful for their environment. Now, this happens very early in vision. It happens a little bit later for abilities that depend on the frontal lobe, things like language and memory and reasoning. The number of synapses peaks by about 4 years of age and then undergoes this pruning period that concludes at the very end of adolescence. And so this is presumably the period in which children's brains are uniquely open to learning all kinds of things. That's why we school them so intensively, math and science and reading and writing. But in addition, this is also a very crucial phase for gender learning and what students' self-concept and future goals arise from. So what I was just showing you a moment ago was the gray matter of the brain. Synapses and dendrites constitute the gray matter. There's also intense plasticity of the white matter of the brain, and that's what this so-called diffusion tensor MRI image is showing myelination, this white area of a part of the brain, the splenium of the corpus callosum that interconnects the two hemispheres. And I love this because I like to point it out when my kids have skipped their piano practice, because this shows the myelination of the splenium as a function of the number of hours of piano practice. And note that's a 10 to the third power, so thousands of hours of piano practice add up to increasing thickness, which presumably allows kids to better, or pianists to better coordinate the movement of the two hands. So we know that both the gray matter and the white matter are plastic, and that this plasticity is most intense in early life, and so that's when we're going to make our biggest impact on children's abilities and future careers. So with that as the background, let's just run through a few of the well-characterized sex differences in various psychological traits, ranging from verbal and spatial abilities to emotional abilities to even motor skills and aggression. I obviously don't have time to talk about all these, but psychologists have studied them for decades and know that if you test a large number of men and a large number of women, you will find males outperforming females on this list of tasks, females outperforming males on this list of tasks. But what often gets left out, particularly in the popular discussion and even in teacher training, is a sense of the size of the difference. And so we really have to talk numbers. We have to be more quantitative when talking about sex differences. The very simple statistic for quantifying effect sizes is to take the mean score on, say, a math test of males, subtract the score from females, and we divide it by the standard deviation, or breadth of the curve. And when we do that, we can come up with effect sizes that by convention are thought to be different levels of significance. So if a D level is less than 0.2, we consider that a small effect. It basically has no real-world significance. When we get up to about D equals a 0.5 level, that's considered a moderate effect, and that actually has some meaningful impact in large populations. For example, in drug trials, we say that it only makes sense for a physician to switch medications if a clinical trial shows that a new drug produces a better outcome with a D value of at least 0.5. So that's kind of the threshold for clinical significance. And then if a D level is above about 0.8, we consider that a large effect. So let's look at some of these D values. And much of this work has been done by Janet Hyde at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, a psychologist who's done really the seminal work on gender differences in various psychological traits. And so in 2005, she published an important article, which I've sent to the NAEP website, basically a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, pulling together all these studies that have been done that have come up with very reliable effect sizes on sex differences in every imaginable psychological trait, ranging from cognitive to emotional to even things like moral reasoning. And what she finds, of the 124 meta-analyses, the vast majority, as you see, have D levels that are down less than 0.35. So these are all in the small range. And also she finds that in most cases the sex differences are smaller in children and grow larger with age. So again, arguing against the idea that they're fundamentally hardwired. And you should read this paper, because she has a very valuable discussion at the end about the cost of our inflated claims of gender difference that seem to be so prevalent in the popular media. But just to draw graphically what we're talking about here in terms of the effect sizes, this is the 0.35 difference that the vast majority of behavioral sex differences falls into. You can see there's mostly overlap between males and females, even something like a science achievement test. And to tell you the truth, this is actually based on some older data from the late 80s, and my guess is these curves would be closer together on science achievement. And compare that to a sex difference in height. We're all familiar with the idea that men are taller than women. It's about a 5 or 6 inch difference. When you calculate the size difference divided by the standard deviation, which is about 2.3 inches, you come up with what's considered a very large sex difference. A D equals 2.6, and contrast that to the kinds of differences we're seeing for traits like verbal skills, spatial skills, et cetera, which tend to be much smaller. And so rather than Mars and Venus, a more appropriate description would be that women are from North Dakota and men are from South Dakota. We're not from different planets quite. Okay, so with that, I sort of crystallized my new thesis of my book, which was the idea that, yes, there are these small innate differences, but they really get magnified. It's like culture and rearing and parenting and peers create a wedge that essentially drives boys and girls further apart, with implications for all sorts of emotional and behavioral skills as well as future careers. And so for the next few slides, what I want to do is talk about some of the sex differences that have been discussed and discovered in infants and consider their size and their later implications. So here's one that gets tons of press. This notion that boys and girls differ in their innate interest for people versus objects, that girls are people-oriented and boys are object-oriented. And there's been many, many studies of this over the decades. Back in 1974, Eleanor Maccabee published a book, The Psychology of Sex Differences, that found no convincing evidence that boy babies were more interested in objects and girls are more interested in faces. But in the year 2000, Jennifer Connellan at Simon Baron-Cohen's lab in Cambridge, England, published this study that has been cited all over the popular media, parenting magazines, et cetera. And what they found was that they took newborn babies and basically let them look at Jennifer's face or let them look at this crazy mobile, which is a collage of a photograph of her face that has all the same spatial dynamic and color properties as her own face. They also attached a little ball here to make it move and have some interesting motion to it. And what they found when they compared boys and girls, actually a bunch of boys and girls couldn't make it through the study. These were one-day-old babies, but of those that did make it through the study, they found that girls spent more seconds looking at the face than boys did, and boys spent more seconds looking at the mobile than girls did. But look at the small size of the difference here. It's just a few seconds on the face, maybe 10 seconds on the mobile. This has been blown up into this popular perception that boys are object-oriented and girls are people-oriented, in spite of the fact that every other study or many other studies that have looked at this have found no gender difference in infants' face versus object perception. And that has been well documented by Elizabeth Spelke in another 2005 article published in American Psychologist. So it's once again the case where the popular media finds one study they like that confirms the stereotypes, and they don't bother to look at the meta-analysis of all the data. There's also some other problems with this study that are crazy. The fact that Jennifer was the live subject in this, and she was not actually blind to the gender of the babies in every case. So it really needs to be repeated. And I've spoken with Simon Baron-Cohen, and he agrees. They need to repeat this study using a photograph compared to a mobile instead of a live face compared to a mobile. But here it is, 10 years later, they haven't bothered to repeat it because it's probably the most widely cited infant research study thus far. For example, here is something from a public school in Florida that touts its single-gender educational program. They're trying to encourage parents to sign up their kids for single-gender classes. Of course, it has to be a choice in the public schools, but they've published this brochure with just all kinds of pseudoscience in it, with this big, bold headline, the idea that boys and girls learn differently, which, as I said, has become kind of a dogma. And it's based on supposed differences in hearing. And look at this one, the difference they put under this difference in vision. Given a choice between a spinning mobile and a human face, newborn boys prefer to look at the mobile, newborn girls prefer to look at the face. So here is one paper published 10 years ago that's having this impact on educational choices, even though it doesn't reflect all of the scientific data, nor was there a choice. The children were never shown one face and then the object. They were shown one at a time, and the number of seconds were counted. Anyway, so it's just very bad extrapolation of science, and yet it's being inflicted on our kids in some 500 schools around the country that have now gone to these single-gender programs based on exactly this kind of pseudoscience. Continuing our look at sex differences in infants, this shows a large study of verbal development, a couple thousand toddlers done at San Diego State University by Larry Fenson and colleagues. It's popularly believed that girls talk earlier than boys, and it's true. However, the difference is only about 1 month. So the average 20-month-old toddler girl speaks about 200 words, and it takes the average boy about 21 months to get to that level. So it's a small difference, and in fact, this has been looked at with thousands of children around the world. The D-value is only about 0.2, or down in the level that we consider clinically insignificant. In fact, it's clinically insignificant if a child has a language delay. The speech pathologists do not have separate charts for boys and girls to determine when they have speech delay. Their verbal skills are close enough that we don't bother. And in fact, when behavioral geneticists look at verbal differences, gender accounts for just a tiny proportion. Only 3% of the variance in language skill across the population is explained by gender differences. So another example of a very small difference, and yet it does get magnified as children grow up and learn how to read and write. And so this is the reading scores, the nation's report card that complement the math scores I showed earlier. But whereas the math gap is really tiny, boys outperforming girls by just about 3 points at the end of high school and not at all in early elementary school, you see that girls are outperforming boys in reading at all ages, and the gap continues to grow throughout schooling. And so it just speaks to this notion that we start with small verbal differences, and then the amount of time you spend talking, the amount of time you spend reading, the amount of conversation you engage in with your parents and friends will influence your later verbal abilities. Moving on to another small difference that gets bigger, aggression. We all know that males are more physically aggressive than females, but look at this. In 2- and 3-year-olds, boys are only slightly more likely to hit, bite, or kick in the toddler rooms, various preschools, than girls are. Actually, this was parents' report. And the point about this is that aggressive behavior, or the suppression of aggression, is largely learned. Most kids learn that it's not appropriate to be aggressive. Girls learn this more quickly than boys. About the beginning of kindergarten, girls are half as likely to physically aggress than boys are. They learn that it's not ladylike. So there is certainly a large cultural component to this sex difference in aggression, although I concede that there is also a role for prenatal testosterone, which we will talk about shortly. Toy preference. If it's one thing that convinces parents that boys and girls are hardwired different, it's that boys like trucks, girls like dolls. Well, the real data tell us that up to 1 year of age, boys and girls both prefer dolls over trucks. And it kind of makes sense because we know that infants have a strong preference for the human face. It's what keeps them alive and nurtured. And so you actually see that boys prefer dolls over trucks up to about age 1, and then this changes very dramatically. And so what happens is we have definitely some role of prenatal testosterone that shapes boys' interest in motion and physical movement, that makes trucks more interesting for them than to girls. And as they get interested in trucks, and as they hear their dads disapproving of their interest in dolls or sister's Barbie dress and so on, we start to see the gap between boys grow dramatically, where they're not touching the dolls by age 5. Whereas girls do this interesting thing. They kind of merge their interests in girls' toys and boy toys by the time they're 5. The reason being in that our culture, it's okay for girls to play with boy toys, but of course it's not okay for boys to play with girl toys. So again, there's an innate difference, but it becomes strongly magnified, and it magnified in different ways in boys and girls with early learning. Now, turning to the realm of spatial skills, and these are something that I want to really emphasize for later math and science abilities. There were a couple of studies that came out quite recently, just about a year and a half ago, showing that not newborn, I think there were 3, 4, and 5-month-old babies actually show a sex difference in their ability to do mental rotation. Mental rotation is your ability to recognize an object in 3 dimensions and appreciate whether it's the same or a different object when it's been rotated. And in this study done by Moore and Johnson, published in late 2008, and there was another study done by Quinn and Liben, published also in Psychological Science. Both studies found a small difference where boy babies were better at appreciating that an object was mentally rotated than girls. So this shows it's a complicated experiment I don't have time to get into, but this is basically before, and I'm sorry, the yellow is basically before, and the blue is basically after mental rotation, and you see that the boys perform differently. They're better able to recognize an object that has been mentally rotated. Now, it turns out mental rotation is one of the largest gender differences in adults in terms of cognitive skills. It's not as large as sex difference in height or throwing ability, but when we talk about cognitive abilities, the D value is on that medium size. It's about 0.56. I calculated for this infant study, I believe it was on the order of about 0.2 or 3. So the difference does seem to grow. We also know through lots of research by many scientists, including Nora Newcomb, that various experiences can improve performance at spatial skills like mental rotation, and these include, believe it or not, video game play, which when you think about mentally rotating objects, you can imagine how all those shooting and driving and targeting games that boys are much more fond of may be good for this kind of skill. There's also evidence that sports, certain types of hand-eye coordination sports, may be good for mental rotation ability. Let me just run through a couple more spatial skills. The water level task is something that boys outperform girls on and men outperform women, although the good news is that the sex difference is shrinking, that that girls are getting better at appreciating that the line should be drawn in the true horizontal, although on average girls and women do tend to draw the line not as a true horizontal, which of course is where water will have to settle. But there's been some really simple studies showing that with practice, girls can get the waterline task. They can get better at mental rotation. This is another task that's shown a large gender difference, and I just throw these up here to show you. In fact, internationally, this showed, I believe, a D value close to 1, where men are better able to recognize that this is the same orientation as line number 3, and this is the same orientation as line number 9. So it just highlights, I think, that whatever our innate biases, the experience of working in 3 dimensions with shapes that rotate and flip and turn, that should be part of our educational and geometry training, needs to be better emphasized to help girls in this domain. Okay, so I'll talk for a couple of minutes about what's known about the effects of hormones on these various abilities. Hormones, of course, differ between males and females in adulthood. They do not differ in childhood. There's no significant difference in testosterone or estrogen levels after about 6 months of age and until children enter puberty at 9, 10, 11, 12 years of age. But there is a rise in testosterone in boys before birth, which is important for the development of certain abilities, or at least the initial bias. Estrogen is high in both boys and girls because of the placenta, but that doesn't cross into the brain, so it's really just this that's important. There's also postnatal surge in both boys and girls, gonadal hormones, but thus far, scientists have not uncovered any reliable brain or behavioral consequence of that in humans or non-human primates. And then, of course, we'll talk about the role of hormones after puberty, which have been studied extensively but really are not very impressive in terms of affecting our cognitive abilities. So this is a quick summary of what a lot of research has found looking at the effects of hormones on behavior. Before birth, that little spurt of testosterone, which begins about 7 months prenatal and ends by about 25 weeks, begins about 7 weeks after conception and ends by about 25 weeks. It is known to influence, not definitively, but to bias sexual orientation. It also seems to play a role in that preference for trucks and balls and moving objects. But surprisingly, has little effect on a child's gender identity. They're very sensitive whether they're a boy or girl, and also, for our purposes, very little effect on later cognitive skills. And then after puberty, we have, of course, the rise of testosterone in boys and estrogen and progesterone in girls, and these have been extensively studied. A lot of famous work on looking at hormones in postmenopausal women, for example, the Women's Health Initiative. There's also been some fascinating studies of transsexuals undergoing hormonal changes. And surprisingly, the effects are quite equivocal. There's very little convincing that's come out in terms of effects of hormones on our thinking ability. So I'll just talk for a moment about the prenatal side, and most of our understanding of that comes from studies of girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. These are girls exposed to high levels of testosterone before birth due to a single gene defect. The good news is that this is a very treatable disorder. Girls get hormone treatments. They usually have to have surgery because their genitalia are somewhat masculinized by these high levels of androgen before birth. But behavioral studies of these girls later in life result in this hierarchy of effects. So it appears that prenatal testosterone actually is important in shaping our initial interests. It also seems to shift sexual orientation. So girls with CAH are more likely than control girls to be bisexual or lesbian. However, the vast majority of girls with CAH nonetheless are heterosexual. So it's a shifting, but it's not an absolute determinant. And then when we get down, surprisingly, to cognitive abilities, those spatial skills, and especially gender identity, girls with CAH nonetheless are happy being girls. They do not want to change to be boys later in life, and so I think that's rather surprising, but it turns out that the gender that we label them and the way we dress them and treat them from birth, provided it's right at birth, is quite important in children's self-identity. And let me just add that of the effects of prenatal testosterone, it's looking like boys' activity level and perhaps inhibitory control, their ability to sit still and focus, seems to be the things that are shaped by prenatal testosterone. But that's not really what we're focused on for today. I think I'm going to have to skip over the next few slides. I just wanted to alert your attention to the fact that there's a lot of pop science out there that's misinterpreting this hormonal data, and it's not true that boys from the get-go learn differently than girls. It's not true that the menstruating brain changes by 25% every month. When this work, which is The Female Brain, came out a few years ago by Louann Brizendine, she just published The Male Brain, but the same headline fits for both. It was reviewed in the journal Nature, called her work Psycho-Neuro-Endocrinology, this idea that, all of our sex differences in thinking abilities are shaped by hormones. It's simply not supported by existing evidence. Now, teachers are probably reading more along the lines of these books, Leonard Sachs's Why Gender Matters, where he basically lays out this case that boys and girls are fundamentally different. They see the world differently. They hear differently. As I point out in my book, these sensory differences are real but very, very small and have absolutely no consequence in the classroom. And then also the work of Michael Gurian, who has led the charge to convince teachers that boys and girls learn differently, exclamation point, which he attributes to millions of years of evolution. In fact, there's very little solid science in his writings, and yet he's training hundreds, if not thousands, of teachers every year in the differential treatment of boys and girls. So when you read in Newsweek magazine that males have less serotonin and females have more oxytocin and boys have higher testosterone, and that's why we have to put them in different classrooms and let girls talk about their feelings, and boys have timed multiple choice tests as opposed to girls, just beware, because when I searched the scientific literature looking at PubMed for data on oxytocin and serotonin, this is what I found. I had to go back to 1990 Journal of Clinical Chemistry to see there's no significant difference in serotonin. 5-HT is an abbreviation for the transmitter serotonin, which is obviously important in mood and behavior. But there's no sex difference in newborns. There's no significant sex difference in children, adults, or the elderly. So teachers really shouldn't be adjusting their classrooms based on serotonin levels, nor should they adjust their classrooms based on oxytocin levels. Oxytocin really is the love hormone, the bonding hormone that is released in women when they're breastfeeding, but it's also present in males. And as this study shows, there's no significant sex difference. This was the only study I found of human children looking at oxytocin and vasopressin levels, published just a few years ago in the Proceedings of National Academy of Science. As you see, no significant difference in oxytocin or vasopressin between boys and girls. So this idea that girls are hardwired to have to talk about their feelings, to bond more, simply isn't true. Boys are very emotional. Boys are every bit as capable and needing of bonding with their parents and friends as girls are. All right, a quick tour of claims about sex differences in the brain. There's been quite a lot of talk about this lately. Obviously, there have to be differences in the brain because of the fact that our behavior are reliably different. But what I want to show in the next couple of slides is just that we don't know what those differences are, and so they're likely to be quite subtle. Here's one we do know for sure. Men have larger brains than women, about 9%. This is a statistically large difference, and this just shows head size measurement. Head size is a very good surrogate for brain size, and doctors do use separate charts for growth of girls' and boys' heads when we're keeping track of their development early on. We also can measure brain size in adults and see the significant males' larger brains than females throughout life, but you know, this 9% difference is pretty close to the difference in height, pretty close to the difference in birth weight. Boy babies are bigger than girl babies, and you know, I had a harder time finding, there's like hundreds of studies on brain size differences, very few on other organs, but it turns out the liver, the kidney, the heart, all the organs are larger in males than females, so it's hard to appreciate what that has to do with anything cognitive or emotional. Here's, so brain size is reliably different. The other thing we know is that girls' brains finish growing earlier than boys' brains, and so this is the result of a large study conducted by Jay Gede's group at the NIMH. Len Root was the first author. And what you see in these curves, red is girls, blue is boys. This is the shift from, this is the end of the pruning phase, when children's brains go from a net increase in gray matter to a net decrease. And as you see, this shift happens earlier in girls than boys in pretty much all of the lobes. And so it does seem to match up with girls' physical maturation. Girls, of course, go through puberty about 1 to 2 years earlier than boys. But it's, again, it's hard to interpret, to relate that to math scores or science or reading scores or science or anything else. Women are claimed to have different corpus callosum from men. Specifically, our corpus callosum is claimed to be larger in women than men when you correct for our overall smaller brain size, but it turns out that when researchers have done meta-analysis, in other words, they've pulled together, in this case, about 50 studies of corpus callosum size in men and women, the effect size has gone to 0. 0 is no difference. Early studies suggested there was a difference, but as researchers increase the N, you see that the effect size has diminished, and we no longer believe there is any difference in corpus callosum between males and females. But that's not what you'll read when you hear about why boys and girls learn differently. Similarly, this idea that language is processed in a more lateralized or one hemisphere way in males and females, in males and females. This started in 1995 with a good paper by Sally Shaywitz and her colleagues at Yale. They found basically something that looked like this, that women showed both hemispheres, left and right, activated more symmetrically than men when they were performing a language task in the MRI scanner. But the truth is, when additional research has followed up on this, again, when we restrict our analysis to meta-analyses, Iris Sommer from the Netherlands published in 2008 meta-analysis showing when you put all the studies together, including Shaywitz, which is up here, what you find is 0 grand difference. The grand mean, there's no difference in lateralization of language function, at least with this paradigm, between females and males. And the next slide relates to that as well. There's no significant difference in the asymmetry of this Planum temporale, which is an important structure for language. It was initially claimed that men were more asymmetric than women, but in fact, both sexes are somewhat asymmetric in the Planum temporale because this is the hemisphere that's dominant for language in everybody. More recently, there's been large-scale MRI studies, and this shows a functional MRI. This article came out just 6 months ago showing that, yes, if you study a large enough population, you do see that men resting brain activity is slightly more lateralized than females. Perfectly symmetrical would be at 0. And so, but this difference looks like it's on the order of 0.2, 0.3, just like the psychological differences we were discussing. And finally, yet another very recent study looking at a very large population of functional brain imaging. You can, if you test a large enough group of men and women, see parts of the brain that are connected differently in males and females. The pink areas shown by the pink curves have different connectivity in females and males, and this is a really complicated study, but I just want you to focus on the size of the difference, that whatever brain activation differences we have are all on the statistically small side. And finally, when you see a functional imaging study and you see that, men process something like mental rotation differently from females. In this case, we see men using their parietal lobes. We see women using their parietal lobes plus their frontal lobes. You really have to ask yourself, what about children? Because these are individuals who've spent 25 years. We always study 25, 30-year-old subjects, living their lives as males and females, hitting baseballs, building with Legos. Of course, their brains are going to be operating somewhat differently. In fact, the one study that has looked at functional brain imaging of mental rotation in children found no difference between boys and girls. So anytime you see a sex difference in the brain, you have to ask yourself, is it nature or nurture that's causing the difference? And I'll just give you one of our favorite studies in neuroplasticity, this finding that the hippocampus of the brain actually is larger in taxi drivers who've been driving taxi for longer numbers of years as a function of number of years, months they've been driving. And this was recent. I was happy to see this was recently replicated by Eleanor McGuire. She compared bus drivers to taxi drivers. Taxi drivers in London have to know this exquisite navigation knowledge. Bus drivers don't. They just get on their route. And lo and behold, the hippocampus is larger in taxi drivers, not as a function of gender, but as a function of experience. So here's a little thought experiment for you. It's a study of individuals who were put in the MRI scanner and asked to evaluate themselves. They were asked to perform a self-judgment, actually a moral judgment of whether they were a good person in a certain situation or not. And you see subject X has strong activation of the medial prefrontal cortex. Subject Y has this tiny little activation of the frontal pole. And I deliberately am misleading you to think that this is a woman and this is a man. In fact, these were two individuals from China who differed only in religion. So one was raised as a Christian, one was raised as a non-believer, and I just want you to appreciate that gender learning has got to be at least as potent as religious training and other culture experience in shaping the way our brains function. So just because you see brains light up differently doesn't necessarily mean these are hardwired. The brain is what we do with it, and differences in adults do not tell us anything about what men and women are hardwired to do. So with that, I'm just going to flash through these several slides that are probably more familiar to you about the roles of social learning, and I did try to weave into my book both sides of the equation, the nature side and the nurture side. So we know that parents don't treat boys and girls exactly equally, that when boys are successful, they tend to have their success attributed to ability. When girls are successful, their success tends to be attributed to hard work, and that boys and girls actually internalize those differences. Peers are obviously a very important influence, and we see that, we see that in children who prefer, get very fussy about wearing the right thing or not signing up for an art class if it's a little boy because there aren't any other little boys in the class, vice versa for girls in science in some cases. But keep in mind, this applies even to adults. I mean, you know how hard it's been to get men into teaching and nursing. And there's clearly, I think, in the computer field, a big barrier for women to go into those fields because of the sense that it somehow challenges their femininity. Teachers are part of this equation. We know teacher expectations are important. And so I think we have to be very careful when we tell teachers anything's hardwired because that is undoubtedly going to shape their expectations for their children. And finally, of course, there's the role of the larger culture. And I just would like to point out that while certain sex differences are declining, for example, athleticism and math scores are getting closer between boys and girls, other sex differences are increasing, notably body image dissatisfaction. Girls are more unhappy with their bodies than boys, and this difference has gotten more dramatic in the last several decades. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot here. Here's a study showing that parents have different expectations for boys and girls. You know, the story is we tried to raise our children in a gender-neutral way. We treated our son and daughter exactly the same, but they were different from the get-go. Our son liked trucks and balls and guns, and our daughter liked pretty frilly things and so on. And, of course, parents, it's impossible to be perfectly gender neutral. It's impossible to interact with an infant if you don't know if it's a boy or girl. Usually the first question is this a boy or girl? And that's why parents decorate their kids in pink or blue so they don't have that awkward question. But the truth is that parents don't treat boys and girls identically, and the differences are largely in infants, in the eye of the beholder. This is just a study done at NYU. It published in 2000, showing that mothers, when they asked their babies were asked to judge how steep of a slope do you think your baby will crawl down. The moms of girls tended to predict a shallower slope than the moms of boys, who predicted a steeper slope, when in fact, when the babies were tested, they were both capable of crawling equally steep slopes. So mothers underestimate their daughter's physical courage, and there's good evidence for that on the playground. Barbara Morangiello in Canada has done studies showing that parents are much more express much more caution to their daughters out on the playground than their sons. So we certainly don't treat children identically. And when you think of the role of exploration and curiosity in development of a scientific interest, you can see how that may impair girls' development in those fields. This is a slide I threw in because the topic of epigenetic development is very hot in biomedical science, and we're increasingly finding how experience can permanently alter actually the structure of DNA by covalently modifying the DNA base pairs with methyl groups or modifying the histone proteins that coil up the DNA into chromosomes. And it turns out that early nurturing experience does this to the DNA that then has effects lasting throughout life. Now, scientists have not been studying this in terms of gender differences, but it is known from earlier research by Celia Moore that mother rats actually lick and groom their male pups more than their female pups. And it's precisely this licking and grooming that has been linked to methylation and acetylation of the DNA that in turn affects stress response in the brain. And so it's time for scientists to begin studying how early parental interaction may act during a critical period to wire up the male and female brain differently because of different interaction styles. We have all the roots there in the biology to explain this, but no one is actually studying this at the moment. So when we think of culture, I think it's pretty clear that boys and girls grow up in separate universes. We do this to them even before they're born now. We identify gender, and then, of course, the toy choices are quite different. But when we can make a crossover, it's usually beneficial for boys and girls. I talked about the advantages of cross-training, and here's a study. There's also other work from Melissa Hines in London showing that girls with older brothers, not surprisingly, are more interested in male playthings than girls without older brothers. This was actually a study involving twins. They were looking for whether there was a prenatal hormone effect on play behavior from twins, and there doesn't appear to be. But as a control group, they threw in individuals with older brothers and look at this dramatic increase in the amount of time girls will play with things like sports and building toys if they have an older brother. And similarly, boys with older sisters aren't any less masculine, but they are more feminine. They are more prone to play with girl things, and actually there's other evidence that verbal skills are promoted in boys with sisters. This is a very recent study by Quinn Liben at Penn State, and she studies social impact on gender learning. She's also looked at the role of pubertal hormones and finds very little effect, as I mentioned, on cognitive skills. The one thing pubertal hormones do, not surprisingly, they increase sex drive. So testosterone in boys and girls at puberty goes up and increases their interest in sex, but it doesn't seem to do much for their spatial skills or even their depression risk, surprisingly. But this is a study from Quinn Liben where they deliberately manipulated gender in a preschool classroom. And so the teachers, it was normally a rather gender-neutral, progressive preschool, but when the researchers asked the preschool teachers to make gender salient, to label the children, boys and girls, to divide them up for different activities, to make separate bulletin boards for boys and girls, what they found was in just 2 weeks' time, children's own attitudes about gender became much less flexible. So this is the low salience group, this is the high salience. This is where this was the period of time when gender became important, and you see how children's gender attitudes about who can be a firefighter and who can be a doctor and so on decreased after just 2 weeks of experience of being labeled as gender, as boys or girls. And there was also increased segregation of boys and girls spontaneously after this manipulation. So that kind of argues against the idea of single gender grouping. Now, this is an interesting study done by an economist, Thomas D., and it's a small effect, admittedly, but it does suggest that children benefit, perhaps, from teachers of the same gender, and at least in the case of science, English, and social studies, it was not found to be true for math, and this is middle school age children, but there is a small effect, about a 4% difference in improvement in girls' scores in these areas or boys if the teacher was of the same gender. And so there does seem to be some role modeling that's important. And also the studies of single-sex schooling, this seems to pull out too from that research. You're probably aware, I'm sure, of stereotype threat, so I will kind of skip over this slide, but this is the idea that one's awareness of one's group as a stigmatized minority, or in the case of math and science, when girls are taking a very challenging test, they may lose confidence if they're led to believe that their gender is not as good, which of course is in the prevailing culture. And if you actually measure physiologically, there's measures of increased anxiety, increased stress hormones, blood pressure goes up, and so on, when somebody's taking a test that their gender or their race is thought to do poorly on. This was a recent study looking across many, many cultures at the degree to which people in a particular culture tend to stereotype math and science as male activities, liberal arts as female activities, and it turned out to have, even when you pull out the outliers, a significant correlation between these implicit stereotypes and the actual gender gap in 8th grade math performance. So above 0 are countries where boys outperform girls. Below 0 are countries where girls outperform boys. And you see the more stereotypical the view, the increased male advantage, and the less stereotypical view, the increased female advantage. With the U.S. the U.S. is up here. And finally, returning to the work of Janet Hyde and her collaborators, they've pulled together data from many, many countries. I believe this was the PISA data and a TIM study as well, other studies. But anyway, 500,000 adolescents, and they found that overall the math gap is quite small, but math confidence and math anxiety do differ much more significantly. So girls are less confident in spite of the fact that they're actually virtually equally capable. So I thought we should end with their quote that girls will perform at the same level as their male colleagues when they're encouraged to succeed, are given the necessary educational tools, and have visible female role models excelling in mathematics. This was a study out of the University of Chicago just recently that found that girls whose elementary school teachers had higher math anxiety, by the end of the year, those girls did not make the improvement, as much improvement as, this is improvement by the end of the year. Boys improved regardless of their teachers' attitudes. Girls improved more if their own teachers showed less math anxiety than otherwise. Okay, so let me then just end very quickly with a renewed plug for the value of gender-neutral rearing. It actually does make a difference in what we preach and what we explain and what we expect of our children. We have to start teaching spatial skills earlier. These are teachable, particularly in the realm of spatial mathematical concepts, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. There's much more we could be doing to have girls manipulate objects in space, both real and virtual skills. Now, I know we have reading specialists now, and I think it's absolutely time that we bring math and science specialists into early education, particularly since these are areas that teachers, elementary school teachers, are not always terribly comfortable with. This just speaks to the hands-on experience I was talking about before, and there's no excuse now. There are so many great there's so much great computer software now for manipulating visual spatial perception. And I talk in my book about one program in California, the spatial temporal reasoning software that has looked to be very good for promoting children's understanding of fractions, proportions, algebra, using a very visual sort of training procedure. And I think this is precisely the kind of thing that girls in particular will benefit from, particularly for later fields like engineering, architecture, and so on. I think teachers need to be sensitive to the groupings in science labs to make sure that everybody gets their hands on the equipment, that it's not girls that are watching and writing and boys doing the actual experiments. Sometimes that will require single-sex groupings, but sometimes it may come out better in co-ed. I think the whole point is a differentiated instruction so that every child is getting lots of participation. And one idea I came across was that this idea that we reinstitute lab practical exams, where you actually have to get in there and do the chemistry or identify the structures in the anatomy lab yourself, so that the hands-on skills are tested in every child, so they don't have to they don't get to opt out and let somebody else do that. So I've gone way, way over. I'm going to stop now, and I'd be very happy to take questions from any of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lise. I have to say that there was someone who sent me a question that said, fabulous information, now my brain is spinning. Lots to take in.
Okay.
But let me say, first of all, for everyone that's still on the call, that we're going to go ahead there. I do have a couple of questions I'd like to ask that came in through the Q&A option. If any of you want to ask a question, now's the time to do it by using the Q&A function in the live meeting software. And also to remind you that this webinar will be archived on our website. Probably it will be up sometime in the next couple of days. And if you're still on the live meeting software, if you go up to the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see an icon that looks like 3 sheets of paper laying one on top of the other. And you click on that. Those are handouts for today's presentation. You can download those handouts while I'm doing the Q&A section and save them on your computers and pull them up, and they'll include this PowerPoint presentation as well as some other background information that Lisa shared with us. So, Lisa, there was a question that came in about earlier on in the presentation. I think it was the slide that you were talking about, the difference in brain activity or brain growth. Or I'm going to use all the wrong terminology here. When the animal had one eye that was closed. And the question was, so how does being visually impaired impact a child's ability to learn math, et cetera?
That's a good question. I mean, we do definitely know early visual experiences, can have long-lasting implications if it's not treated. Now, the good news is that most of this is kind of academic because pediatricians and pediatric ophthalmologists are very vigilant for visual problems in children. So if a child has strabismus or cataract, which is less common, usually they're treated early and their vision is preserved. Now, if it's not, if one eye is considerably weaker than the other, then that does impair a person's three-dimensional vision. Depth perception. You need 2 eyes working together for depth perception. And so I can imagine that that would prove challenging for spatial skills. Now, spatial skills is maybe half of mathematics. Computation, algebra, statistics, and so on, they're not particularly spatial abilities. And so there certainly remains a lot of math and science that is not spatially dependent.
Right. There was another question that came up. I am wondering where the information about body image and female dissatisfaction increasing came from. I have seen research that shows the gap between males and females has been closing, not because girls are necessarily feeling better about their bodies, but males are feeling worse. Maybe you can respond to that, but also if you have some resources you want to send us later, we'd be happy to include them on the website.
Yes, I will. I'll have to dig up the specific reference. It is in my book. I want to say it was something from Janet Hyde's group, but I will try to look that up and send it along.
Okay. So for those of you still on the call, one of the things that we'll do is any of this follow-up information we'll post on the website where you'll find the archived version of the webinar, and we'll post any additional handouts or materials that Lise sends us in regards to some of these things. Well, Lise, there aren't any other questions. Let me just check one more time. Nope, I think that those are all the questions that have been submitted at this point. I am overwhelmed by the amount of information here. I know that in reading your book, I sort of felt the same way, and I can't tell you how much I really appreciate your sharing with us all this information. I know that I'm going to go back and watch this webinar again because I'm sure half of it didn't stick. But it's fabulous information, and I think you're sort of wrapping this up in the recommendations section is very valuable to the work that we're trying to do, certainly around increasing the participation and success of girls in math and science. And it certainly reinforced a lot of the things that we already know, but it's given me a lot more ammunition to use when we talk about what research supports in terms of the barriers that students are facing.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak to this audience in particular, and I apologize for barreling through. If any of you had questions, please feel free to email me. You can just Google, you'll find my email address if you just Google my name. And, you know, I should add that I did not put in the recommendations the kinds of things that I believe you and your associates are already doing, which is you know, the deliberate affirmative action for getting girls into extracurricular science and math sorts of activities. That sort of goes without saying. I was trying to think a little bit more at a more minute level of things that can happen in a classroom.
Right, because many of those things can be very subtle, like you said. Yeah. Well, thank you again.
Well, my pleasure.
And we're looking forward to more of these sorts of things, and hopefully we'll get you to come and speak at our Professional Development Institute next year in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Sometime around April 10th to the 14th. So take a look at your calendar, Lise, and we'll talk more about that. But I hope those of you who are still in the call will be able to join us then, too.
Amy, I just want to say you have one more question in there if you'd look from Sarah.
Oh, it just popped in? Okay. Oh, you're right. Actually, there's two
I
here.
think Nancy's we can take care of.
All right. So, Sarah, are girls more negatively influenced by the idea that math is uncool than boys are?
I think so. You know, I can't cite specific surveys or data that speak to that. That's certainly what the chess community runs into, I think, getting girls into chess, getting girls into computers. And I just think, you know, I talk about that Lindsay Lohan movie, Mean Girls, right, where she's coerced to be on the math team. Of course, there's no girls on the math team. That's her punishment, is to be on the math team. And I think it's still considered not feminine. So, and of course, it's hitting right at adolescence when kids are most concerned with reaffirming their masculinity or femininity. So it couldn't come at a worse time.
Right.
But, yeah. But, you know, that's where these role models really are important.
Right. Well, that may speak to the fact that we need to look at, I mean, certainly in our work, we try to support development of research proposals to the National Science Foundation and other funders to look at various things, and this may be an area in which we want to try to do more work, is about the effects of these kinds of negative stereotypes on boys and girls during their adolescent development. So,
you know, yeah, excuse me, but the movie Mean Girls is particularly striking because that was a movie meant to be female empowering. You know, it was trying to get at the whole relational aggression thing, which is a very big issue for middle school and high school girls. And yet they use this whole math stereotype thing in a very silly, stereotypical way, which is a shame. And so I think it's an opportunity if that kind of film is shown for teachers to bring up the stereotype and issue.
A teachable moment, as they call
it. Yes.
Yeah, great. Great idea. All right. Well, Greg, I'm going to turn it back to you so you can do your housekeeping wrap-up. And again, Lise, thank you very much. And Freda, thank you for all of your assistance in preparing this webinar. And Greg, I'll let you close the session.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today. Remember that this webinar will be available on the STEMequitypipeline.org website under the Professional Development heading and then under Archived Webinars in the next day or two. In the next few minutes, you will be sent an email with a link to a survey that we would like for you to answer for us. Thank you.
Okay.